Good afternoon. I'm Jenna Foster, and on behalf of the MGAA, I'd like to welcome you to this training session this afternoon, which is being delivered by Searchlight. Before handing over to our presenter, I'd just like to run through a few housekeeping points. I need to advise you that this session is being recorded. Please ensure your microphone and camera are turned off. If you would like to ask a question, please use the chat button at the bottom of your screen. Your questions will be answered during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. However, if we do not have time to answer these, they may be addressed post-event should you provide your contact details. The MGAA's Programme of Learning and Insights has been accredited by the Chartered Insurance Institute for the quality of content and supporting materials, with CPD hours applicable if relevant to your ongoing professional development. The recording of this training will be available on our website with the slides to follow post-event. Finally, I'll be posting a link to the feedback survey in the chat box. Please do take time to complete this, which should take no longer than 2 minutes, as this allows us to deliver the best quality events to our members. Today's training is non-financial misconduct and is being delivered by Nikki Bennett. That's it from me now. Over to you, Nikki.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining me today. In this session today, we're going to explore why the FCA has heightened its focus on non-financial misconduct in the financial sector. Ahead of its forthcoming policy statement, we're going to examine the scope of non-financial misconduct, including bullying, harassment, discrimination and other inappropriate behaviour, and its impact on culture, operations and reputation. Hopefully you'll gain practical insights on identifying risks and effectively addressing misconduct to foster a healthy, ethical workplace. By the end, you'll be equipped to detect, manage and mitigate non-financial misconduct while promoting a strong culture. These are today's learning objectives. So hopefully I'll just read them out if you are including them on your reflective statement. Understand the rationale behind regulatory focus and why the FCA has increased its scrutiny of non-financial misconduct in the financial services sector. Identify types of misconduct and recognise the various forms of non-financial misconduct, including bullying, harassment, discrimination and other inappropriate behaviours. We'll evaluate the risks associated with poor management of non-financial misconduct and its impact on a firm's culture, operations and reputation, and we'll learn ways to detect, address and prevent non-financial misconduct while fostering a positive workplace culture and strong conduct standards. So in terms of the FCA's definition, this is just a reminder. So the FCA describes non-financial misconduct as behaviours or actions within a financial services firm that do not directly relate to the financial aspects of the firm's business, but can still have a significant impact on its conduct, integrity and its reputation. We're anticipating greater clarity on the definition of non-financial misconduct and FCA expectations shortly. Then we're due to release a paper at the end of the year. Hopefully it'll be out by the end of this month. But in terms of the breadth of what kind of things are included in an FM, bullying, harassment, discrimination and any other behaviour which creates a toxic or complicit work environment for any of the staff. And we'll look at them all in a little bit more detail. This type of culture can harm customers if it's not recognised and it's not dealt with by the firm and its senior leaders. That's why it's a big importance. So the FCA's objectives as a conduct regulator are to protect customers, ensure market integrity and support the UK's economic growth and competitiveness. Where the FCA investigates failures in consumer protection, invariably it will find in poor market conduct, they come from the same root cause. And that root cause is about failings in culture. So if there's a failing in culture, then it would suggest that there's an overall failing in the firm's governance. Culture drives conduct. Culture shapes decisions and actions at every level in the business. A foundation of a healthy firm culture is essential. It means strong, inclusive cultures where diverse perspectives prevent groupthink and they support better decision-making overall. The FCA is updating its rules and guidance on financial misconduct and expects to set out more detail in its proposals. And like I say, that should be due out at the end of this month. So this is separate from the broader scope of work that they're doing on diversity and inclusion, which they're considering alongside the PRA, and following on from its consultation and dovetailing with the planned activity by the government. So in February 2024, the FCA issued a survey to just over 1,000 regulated wholesale financial services firms asking about recorded incidents of non-financial misconduct during the period 2021 to 2023. This was the first comprehensive data gathering exercise in relation to non-financial misconduct, and the aim was to better understand the subject and provide a baseline assessment of behaviours, and this will presumably underpin the new rules and guidance that we're anticipating. So I quite like this statement. This is something that was recently in a speech by Emily Shepherd from the FCA. So she's the Chief Operating Officer at the 10th Annual Culture and Conduct in Financial Services Summit. She defined culture in this way. So like a winter bug, making its rounds, culture can move from person to person, meeting to meeting, decision to decision. And it goes back to the FCA's focus on culture driving conduct and decision making. So if we get it right, then it drives good outcomes for consumers, for markets, for our economy overall. And so this is why it's going to continue to be a subject of regulatory focus. And the aim is that, to be informed, responsible and risk-taking. If we're going to have long-term economic growth in the country, it has to be built on strong foundations of healthy cultures within firms. They're actively working with stakeholders to drive up culture and conduct standards across our industry. So in terms of how she better defines this, she talks about when it moves from person to person. She positively talks about a smile, a supportive comment, or a listening ear. These things spread fast and create an atmosphere where people do feel valued, they feel engaged, they feel empowered in the work. But equally, where you have a poor culture, it spreads just as quickly. So a careless comment, a raised voice, silence in the face of a wrongdoing, that can affect the whole team. It threatens the health of the entire organisation. So equally, good or bad culture, it's contagious. So looking at some of the statistics, so the FCA survey found across this bunch of 1,000 that they looked at, that there were 2,347 allegations of non-financial misconduct in 2023. Now, if you look at that overall, that's about 9 a day. And that 9 per day is only the ones that were reported. And I think this is still a topic that goes significantly underreported. The biggest sectors across this survey were medium-sized firms. So they responded, there was between 50 and 249 employees in the London market, intermediaries and wholesale brokers that took part in the survey. I think many of you will have heard horror stories where firms' behaviour goes on, it's unaddressed. Some of you maybe even had the misfortune to have witnessed it firsthand. But I think it's very easy to dismiss incidents as isolated or individual failings. And it's true that you're always going to have an odd bad apple. That's always going to occur. They'll crop up from time to time, and unfortunately such is life. But it's how these behaviours are dealt with or not dealt with, more importantly, that makes the difference to an organisation. So, and we'll talk about it, some of the examples that I use, but turning a blind eye to toxic behaviour not only drives away good staff, but it has to raise serious questions about a firm's wider decision-making and risk management overall. These environments where people don't feel psychologically safe to speak up can become breeding grounds for even bigger problems, hidden mistakes, ignored risks, ultimately harm to consumers or to our markets. And that's why healthy firm cultures will and continue to be not just a moral issue, but a regulatory concern too. And it's something that's massively important for people who are wanting to join our sector these days. I'll talk about some of the cases that be involved in. This is the first one, and many of you may have heard of this case. It was in relation to a company called Odie Asset Management, and the founder of that organisation, a chap called Crispin Odie, was accused of sexual harassment and assault allegations by 13 women over a period of 23 years. And unfortunately, this came to light not in the usual ways or the expected way, should we say, by the FCA. It came to light because of an investigation by the Financial Times. And as a result of that investigation, the FCA are also under some scrutiny, driven by MPs' involvement in terms of the way that it had handled its awareness of the concerns around Crispin Odie. So some of the concerns were around the way it's been handled, but what ultimately happened as a result of this coming into the public eye was that Odie Asset Management itself was directly affected because they dealt with hedge funds other organisations such as JP Morgan, BNP, Goldman Sachs, all these types of companies, they were then under an obligation to sever ties with O'Day Asset Management because obviously it was reputationally damaging to them as well. So they had to be seen to be taking action to protect their own reputations. So in terms of some of those organisations, they'd already felt the fallout of other associations. So JP Morgan, for example, that had to agree a $290 million settlement to victims of Jeffrey Epstein. So they were quickly going to react and respond to another incident such as O'Day Asset Management. In terms of the way that the firm dealt with it, there were some delays in updating the register, but in terms of the way that they dealt with it internally, aware that there were issues with Crispin O'Day, management decided that they would put rules in place to prevent him talking to females on their own or prevent him talking to them about non-work related issues to try and limit his behaviour. Overall, they failed to address it. At one point, O'Day he changed the board to try and avoid some of the decisions that were made, etc. But fundamentally, the firm struggled to deal with it in a way that the FCA would expect. The FCA failed to deal with it in a way that is expected as well. But I think the important thing is to recognise that the breadth of activity that the FCA can take, so they can impose sanctions, they can impose fines, but more importantly, in terms of the immediate damage to a firm, it's the damage of the reputation. There's legal repercussions for it, but also there's repercussions for the broader SMFs who were involved in this situation, who perhaps themselves didn't take the action that the FCA was expecting. For those who were involved, so Crispin O'Day himself, then his career prospects within the financial services industry would be seriously impacted, adversely affected, would limit future opportunities to hold an SMF position. So the ramifications of these kind of things, not just for the firm, but the individuals and the broader individuals involved in becoming aware of the situation, are not insignificant. This was the second case, and I think you will have seen stuff in the press even this week. So a chap called Mr. Staley, he was appointed CEO of Barclays in December 2015. He was approved by the FCA and the PRA to perform the role of the SMF1, so he was chief executive during the 2016 to October 2021 when he left Barclays. The role of the CEO is crucial. It's crucial to set an example, demonstrating sound judgment, etc. But Mr. Staley himself approved a letter sent by Barclays, sent to the FCA, which contained 2 misleading statements regarding the nature of his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein and the timing of their last conduct. So in 2008, Jeffrey Epstein was convicted for procuring a minor for prostitution, and Staley was aware of this fact at the time. He was arrested again in July 2019 in relation to broader charges for sex trafficking of minors. The FCA didn't find evidence that Staley was aware of Epstein's alleged crimes, but they requested a written statement from Barclays, so a written assurance that there was no impropriety in Staley's relationship with Epstein. So though Barclays responded to the letter, Staley didn't have a close relationship, he said. There wasn't anything that would suggest misconduct, but the statement itself was incorrect. So he had confided in Epstein on significant matters. He disclosed, confidential discussions. So between the period in question, they'd exchanged over 1,100 emails, with Staley describing Epstein as one of his deepest and most cherished friends. So the fact that the FCA has then, questioned the validity of the statement. So as a result, the FCA imposed a financial penalty of 1.8 million on Staley. They prohibited him from performing any senior management or significant influence function in any regulated activity carried on by an authorised person. Now, Mr. Staley is currently appealing the financial penalty and the ban imposed by the FCA. He testified recently, denying knowledge of Epstein's crimes and attempting to clear his name. So his appeal is being heard at London's Upper Tribunal, where he's challenging the FCA's findings and the imposed sanctions on him. So that case remains ongoing, but obviously gives you an insight into the breadth of what the FCA can do and the impact long term. On a much more probably relatable scale, you've got a situation where you had a family ties circumstance in this particular instance. So Mr. A Senior was a director along with his brother, Mr. A Junior, if you like, of an authorised consumer credit firm. Both were approved by the FCA, both held senior management functions. In May 2020, Mr. A Senior pleaded guilty and was convicted of a grievous bodily harm and possession of an offensive weapon offence, having attacked a security guard with a bar at a bar with a machete. Now, he was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment by the Crown Court, and this came to light. When it came to light, the FCA decided to remove him as an SMF. Didn't feel that he was fit and proper to be working in financial services, and then prevented him from doing so in the future. They banned Mr. A Senior from working in financial services following his conviction, but under the principles of a firm to be honest and open. Mr. A Junior, so his brother, had no other defence other than to report his own brother to the FCA, because he had to do, otherwise it would have brought into question his own fitness and propriety to hold an SMF function. So understanding his own obligations, he had to himself tell the FCA about his brother's conviction to protect his own future and that of his regulated entity. So doing the right thing, albeit very challenging circumstances for him. So in terms of these cases, they are quite high-level case studies, and you may be sitting thinking, well, this is all a bit far-fetched. Why does it actually matter to me? But what they do highlight is the potential reputational impact where something does go wrong and what impact that can have on the industry. So if we look at some of the main areas that may impact on you, and some of them you may not be aware of, then it may help bring this to life a bit. But in terms of the Me Too movement and the attitude of millennials called out and shone a light on behaviour and culture more broadly, so particularly casual sexism. And if you look at assessing those involved, they should form part of assessing fitness and propriety. So some of the typical culture, particularly in some of the London market, was that of a boys' culture. There was negative reactions to those who wanted to speak out. There was challenges in employing women in roles. But if you look at, there was a freedom of information request to see how many cases had actually been reported. And in 2021, that was only four cases against senior managers, which is incredibly low. And the FCA admits that it's concerned about the statistics. But in terms of the way in which these things come about, so treating women as clerical support, being patronised, criticised for being pregnant, despite holding very professional and technical roles, all these kind of things, attractiveness being perceived as shallow or unintelligent rather than, the positions that they were, or asking, they were particularly women, you would find them trying to dress more masculine, to be taken more seriously, or taking offence at being referred to as love or dear or girls. They consider that to be sexist. So it takes many forms, and the breadth of it depends obviously in the environment you're in, but obviously some of those cases are then linked to sexual harassment and sexual discrimination. So there's lots of ways in which it can come about. Bullying and harassment is also incredibly broad. Harassment is defined as unwanted conduct related to a relevant characteristic, to which has the purpose or effect of violating a person's dignity or creating a hostile, degrading, humiliating or offensive environment for that particular person. So that can be about age, disability, gender reassignment, race, religion or belief, sexual or sexual orientation. A claim for harassment when you don't have a characteristic can be raised. So the easiest way I can explain that is if you felt that somebody that you worked with was being subject to harassment, so it might not be against you personally, but you were able to experience and see firsthand what was happening to them, you as that individual can raise a case of harassment against somebody else. But the impact of these kind of things can be stress, anxiety, anger, frustration, reduction in job performance, lack of self-confidence or self-esteem. It can increase sick leave. You can have a negative organisation culture that starts to create something that's a bit more toxic, which reduces morale, poor relationships between colleagues, and in extreme cases, individuals affected can feel that they've got no choice to resign, either because it's them personally affected or because they're in an environment they're not particularly comfortable with. So there's overall duty of care for an employer. So they must prevent and deal with bullying and harassment in the workplace. Employees need to know that bullying and harassment are unacceptable. There'll be a zero tolerance. And if an employer fails in its duty of care, and an employee resigns, then they could have a case of constructive dismissal, which is often costly. So quite often employers don't adequately protect health, safety or well-being of their staff. And then they can be seen to be in breach of their own contract with their employees, which again is costly for firms. There's other things fall into this category, which are things like abuse of power. So violence in this situation, so abuse of power, violence and intimidation. Violence can refer to intentional use of physical force or power, whether it's threatened or actual, and that's against, one person, another person or a group, that results or has a high likelihood of resulting in injury, death, psychological harm or deprivation. Whereas intimidation is the act of threatening, coercing or installing fear in somebody that can influence their behaviour, decisions or emotions. That can be verbal threats, making menacing statements, non-verbal cues, so aggressive body language, staring somebody down, psychological pressure, so manipulation and blackmail. So again, quite broad. Other things that the industry has taken some action against is things like working under the influence of alcohol or drugs. So there was concerns in the FCA's survey and considerations of the market that consumption of alcohol in work, it's not necessarily misconduct unless it's forbidden by that individual firm, but what it can do is give rise to a drop in professional standards and then a rise in cases of misconduct. So the City of London was part of that culture that had been around for a long time, but Lloyd's of London took a serious stance on it, introduced a zero tolerance drinking ban during working hours. Some insurers followed suit in order to be seen consistent in those standards. But basically, there's a question around impaired judgment. If you are drinking, is your judgment the same as it would be before you'd had 2 bottles of wine? Have you got a clear head at 10 a.m. in the morning versus what you might be after you've had a drink? But also, what they found in the survey was that there was a rise in verbal or physical aggression, or the risk of, which in turn then led to potential for sexual harassment and that type of thing. So that was that was something that was of concern. But I think the important thing on the breadth of this as well is it not only does it apply to during working hours, then it applies to work social events as well, and it equally applies to alcohol as it does to drug and other substance abuse. So I think there's also, if you look on the flip side of it, so you've got those who are participating in a question over their behaviour, but also the culture where it is driven by decisions being made in the pub, team events being held in the pub, or those kind of environments where those who don't drink for religious reasons or health reasons, they're excluded or not felt welcome, because that's the culture of the firm. So again, that drives perhaps a toxic behaviour, or there are situations where people are felt obliged, peer pressure, to get involved in something they're not comfortable with because they're called out if they're not. And again, that's potentially a toxic culture. So talking about some of these things, some of the issues that we've talked about can be a breach of company policies, and where there is a breach of company policies, whether they're taking part here and whether they're taking part abroad. So you will have seen instances perhaps in the press where an incident has happened while somebody has been on holiday, but their behaviour is reputationally damaging to something that is the business in the UK. So that will be covered by perhaps their company policy, so they will be in breach of company policy. Social media profiles. The FCA these days has got a lot more sophisticated in terms of what it is able to look at for critical individuals in the business. The onboarding process for new SMFs or certified functions is a lot more detailed than it ever was, and they will trawl social media. And when we do that kind of thing, we will look for anything that's adverse in social media profiles that could be linked to somebody's specific role. So by that, I mean there is something in their social media that links them to the firm that they're employed by, and there's something not palatable within their social media. So to give you an example, we have done a check on somebody on their profile on one of their social media accounts was, I'll just call it anything, but it was called Rapey Bob. Now, because there was other stuff in their social media that linked them to the firm, that wasn't considered to be fit and proper for a person in that thing. So it's being aware, and all staff being aware of what their social media profiles cover and what that can link to. But obviously, the breadth of that leading to calls into question about what they are then going to do, and you can see things on there like violating expense policy, again calls into question their behaviour, their overall culture, and the overall conduct within the organisation. One of the things that the FCA was concerned about when they did the survey was that 38% of firms had no formal governance arrangements in place for providing management information on non-financial misconduct back up to the board. Now, as a board, particularly where the SMFs are sitting, the role of the business and those within the business with accountability and responsibility is to make sure the SMFs are protected and informed and are in a position to challenge and check back within the business. So if there are no formal arrangements in place to report on non-financial misconduct within the business, well, then we've got some critical risks there for those SMFs. So an SMF, I would say, well, why don't you know? And why aren't you asking? But there also needs to be a means of collating that data. And one of the things for those firms who were involved in the survey was the breadth of questions that were asked. And most firms, looking at the questionnaire, even if they weren't involved in it, was understanding how they collate that level of data and how they make sure that that data is maintained up to date. And a lot of it was done through staff questionnaires, and it's making sure that they're chased down, they're kept up to date. But there's really quite sensitive information being asked in there as well. So it's having the infrastructure to be able to properly manage it. And I think even if you weren't involved in that, it's worth looking at that to see, would you be in a position to be able to collate that data if you were asked? But in terms of, from a regulatory perspective, what's the risks if you don't address it? Looking at the proposals the FCA's talked about, they're detailed, but they're not necessarily simple. And firms can't afford to continue to turn a blind eye to toxic behaviour, because it will turn away good staff. But it also brings about serious concerns about a firm's wider decision making and its impact on risk management. So where people aren't safe or they're confused, so where you've got overlapping rules currently in some of what the FCA has talked about in the proposals is to get greater clarity. One of the important things the FCA is saying is, look, there is not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution to this. It's important that you look at your own culture, your own behaviours, your own conduct, and see whether you have concerns there, whether you are creating a breeding ground that something can lead to a bigger problem, where you have a culture where things get hidden or ignored. We're not addressing things, there isn't psychological safety, because if that's a situation, then you need to be able to better communicate this, you need to have a better infrastructure for dealing with it. Where there are confusing situations in terms of, say, for example, bullying and harassment, what's maybe in a company policy, but where there are things that are in employment law, it's making sure that you've got access to the right resource, whether that's HR specialists that are able to support the firm properly. But fundamentally, all firms need to take proper steps to prevent things that are non-financial misconduct, particularly things like sexual harassment, would be very easily identified but must be dealt with. And thinking about more broadly how this goes back to that definition of culture is contagious, then there is crossover with conduct rules and behaviours. There's crossover with people being fit and proper to hold the functions that they do hold. And there's also crossover with things like threshold conditions, so a firm being obliged to hold adequate resources. And that's not just about money, it's about the right people, it's about the right staff, it's about access to the right support. So whether that is having the right control framework in place, having the right individuals in the right jobs, having access to the right support such as HR. But basically, if the FCA were to find something that it thought was an indicator of concerns in this area, invariably where it suggests that something is fundamentally wrong. And the reason I've popped Donald Trump on there is, as much as I could talk lots about Donald Trump, is basically, although he's been very vocal about overturning some of the DE&I initiatives in the US, the UK has come out and explicitly said to British employers that when considering taking positive action, you should be careful not to use American sources about affirmative action they're taking over there, because they don't reflect the legal position in this country. So it's important to be aware of that. So the legal, cultural and political situation in the UK is not the same as the US. So I've mentioned senior managers being accountable for fostering this culture. They have a vital role to play in ensuring that they are able to demonstrate progress and oversight in this area. They're accountable for promoting a good culture, reducing the opportunity for misconduct, and creating an environment which is conducive to modern and evolving workplaces. In essence, the healthy culture is contagious. So if you've got a situation of an environment where respect, integrity and accountability are woven into the fabric of an organisation, then they act like a social immune system. So you're able to catch bad behaviour early, stop it from spreading, stop it from becoming contagious in itself. So it's important that firms consider whether they've got senior managers and staff whose conduct might negatively affect a workplace culture or public confidence, what they're going to do about that. Are they fit for the role? Is it something they might need a bit more training or a bit more support, or is it something that's a little bit more serious than that? Because all firms have to address that people are fit and proper, and that's equally considering organisations that have got financial and non-financial matters within their group. But if there is a concern, and particularly where something does go wrong, quite often firms will deal with it by quietly letting somebody go or encouraging them to leave. But if that individual was in a role that is subject to a regulatory reference going forward, it's important to recognise that if you are required to provide a regulatory reference for somebody who has left the business, then you have to be completely open and honest. And if you are tempted to avoid that situation and you are caught out, that brings into question your own culture. So you have no choice but to complete a regulatory reference completely honestly, i.e. there is no opportunity to sweep matters under the carpet and hope they will go away. So in terms of you're seeing now there's an increasing number of tribunal cases where whistleblowing is a major factor, actively encouraging whistleblowing within the firm. And I think the important thing to recognise is where a whistleblowing incident in a tribunal case comes about, there is no financial cap on that. So in terms of having an environment where you have set sufficient funds aside to deal with whistleblowing and tribunal cases, then I think from firms who aren't able to address this properly, it's going to be quite expensive to them. And quite often cases are dealt with before getting to a tribunal. But these all relate to unfair dismissal or discrimination matters, and these are stemming increasingly from whistleblowing scenarios. It is gaining momentum. There are seeing an increasing number of exposures with firms, and it's important to not only to get the controls right, but to define that culture very clearly. Having a diverse workforce helps because there is already some social challenge, if you like. There are many benefits to having a diverse and environment that people are actively involved. But what the FCA expects to see in all firms is create an environment where people are free to speak up and they have the right controls in place to identify non-financial misconduct early. This includes whistleblowing. It's positively encouraged, and the FCA positively encourages using its own whistleblowing line. And in scenarios where cases are whistleblown, they will always get picked up by the FCA. It may take some time because they'll be dealt with in what the FCA agrees its priorities, but they will always get picked up at some point in time. So I think it's important for firms to step back and consider, given everything that's out there right now, are they still getting it right? Is there more work to be done? So absolute tone from the top. And if there's concerns about the tone from the top, perhaps needing to do something a bit more proactive, or may have concerns about that, now is the time for the business to call itself out and get that right, get it clear, drive consistency through the business like a stick of rock. Create good initiatives. So it's looking at training and awareness programs, making sure that they're focused on ethics, compliance and conduct standards, making sure it's mandatory for everybody, including the board, including the directors, making sure that integrity and ethical behaviour is driven through the business. Undertaking a risk assessment to see whether there are opportunities for improvement around non-financial misconduct. So identifying areas where it may exist, what's the likelihood and what's the impact if something were to happen. Making sure there's an environment for people to speak out, clear reporting lines, that things will be dealt with confidentiality, in a confidential way. I think there were some concerns over the FCA when there'd been some internal whistleblowing that people involved in that situation were called out. Hence, the FCA is under some scrutiny itself for improving its own in-house controls, but making sure that there is the ability to properly investigate, dealt with impartially, promptly addressing issues before they get toxic, and preventing a reoccurrence going forward if anything were to arise again. Looking at things that may drive the wrong sort of behaviour. So that includes performance appraisals and remuneration policies, looking at the metrics of how those things are measured to make sure that they are picking up ethical and compliant behaviours as well, and not just the usual performance. But fundamentally setting the right culture, driven and supported by the right leaders, having the right leaders in place. People will follow the right leaders. So whether that's, having workshop days or cultural alignment, or making sure that you are recruiting people and recognising an environment where everybody has something that fits with that firm's culture, you're able to take a pragmatic and proportionate approach that suits your culture. But most importantly, make sure you're able to monitor it. Make sure you're able to look at it, you audit it as things move on, so that you're making sure that you're covering everything and you're not taking unnecessary risks, or people don't feel that you are addressing it properly. So just, bringing some of these things to a little close. This was something that Google did, which was quite interesting. So they did a survey. It was a while ago now. They called it Project Aristotle. And it was a comprehensive study aimed at identifying key factors which contribute to effective team performance. They had a lot of researchers. There was 180 teams involved. It was a massive piece of work that they did. But what they were looking at is what made successful teams. And the 5 things that were critical characteristics in successful teams were psychological safety, dependability, so individuals who reliably completed tasks on time, met high standards of excellence, structure and clarity, so teams having clear goals, defined roles, understanding plans for execution. Meaning was an important one. So work was being significant to individuals, providing them with a sense of purpose, team members perceiving work as making a meaningful contribution to the organisation overall. So the psychological safety emerged as the cornerstone of team effectiveness. Teams that cultivated an environment of trust and respect were more likely to engage in open dialogue, leading to increased innovation, better problem solving. So these insights have not only influenced Google and their own internal practices, but they've guided other organisations worldwide in terms of fostering collaborative environments, and that creates high-performing teams. And this is the kind of thing that the FCA is looking for us all to achieve. Culture for me is very easy to define. It's what you do when nobody's looking. It's not just about what you do because somebody's looking. So the cultures, the work that we've been doing over the years is looking at that root cause analysis where there might be a failure, delivering real and sustainable cultural transformations that prevent harm, prevent the opportunity for inappropriate behaviour, include high-risk matters such as DE&I and non-financial misconduct. It's an overarching theme, runs like a stick of rock. The FCA would look to see it, so the supervision they're doing for firms, they will look to see how effective the drivers for behaviour are in reducing the potential for harm. They look to see that obviously in the firm's business model. They're also looking, the things like consumer duty, drive good outcomes. They're looking for things to be embedded within the firm's values, within its ethos. So in terms of that being embedded, it has to be habitual behaviours. It has to be a mindset that characterises an organisation. And culture does drive conduct. So by having diverse workforce, you've got employees from all backgrounds, should feel psychologically safe to speak up and call something out and challenge, because if you have that right culture, what you do when nobody's looking, it means you're doing the right thing every time because it's the right thing to do. So just to bring this to a close, then, call to action is have a think about your own environment, particularly boards and senior managers, understanding what sort of data the FCA expects firms to analyse to better understand the risks, and think about them pragmatically and proportionally to their own business. Consider broader things like COCON, how that goes into practices individually, but also think about where situations do arise. You might have dealt with them in the past. How are you dealing with them now? Is that different? Does it need to be different? Having effective controls in place to investigate, remedy promptly, make sure that, allegations are considered. The fact that it took OD Asset Management however many years it did, 13 allegations over 23 years to finally go, do you think we need to do something about that? That's not acceptable these days. But making sure that you are working towards full compliance with what the FCA expects. So collate the data, have a look about it, do your staff surveys, make sure that you're in a position to analyse employee awareness. Does whistleblowing work as it should? What are your grievance procedures like? Equally, when you're looking at recruiting these days, new recruits are looking for strong commitments to these kind of cultural perspectives, but equally when somebody's leaving, or when you're doing fitness and proprietary assessments that people remain fit and proper for their roles, is consider how you're measuring or exploring these things. Think about remuneration structures. Do they drive the wrong behaviour? I watched an interesting interview recently, some of you may have seen it, but it was the lady who wrote the Bridget Jones, and she was talking about the difference from the first Bridget Jones movie, and basically called it out herself and said, would we be able to make it today? And looking at those who were involved in the interview. So you had some younger people who'd watched the most recent Bridget Jones and then looked at the other, and they were actually shocked when they stepped back and looked in. That what was behaviour, and it's only a short time ago that the first Bridget Jones movie was out, looking at how much things have improved, and so things like Me Too have made a massive difference in that. So things have moved on, but it's making sure the infrastructure and the environment and the culture has equally moved on to support that. So there are important lessons to be learned. Getting employee engagement, I think, is pivotal and crucial, because that creates a strong buy-in from everybody and creates that environment where people do feel safe to speak up, and it also then would support better reporting back up to the boards, get better protection as well for SMF, so increasing this 38% to something that's a lot more palatable. But if necessary, redefine your culture, take the opportunity to reset it, make sure it reflects society as it should today. So these are the learning objectives again. So hopefully I've given you something that allows you to better understand the rationale for regulatory focus and why it's still important to the FCA, why it will remain on the radar, looking at non-financial misconduct in the financial service sector in particularly, thinking about types of misconduct, recognising the breadth of non-financial misconduct, including bullying, harassment, discrimination and other inappropriate behaviours. Going back into your own firms, looking at the risks associated with poor management of non-financial misconduct. Do they exist? What's the potential for impact on reputation, operations and culture? Learning ways in which you can detect them better, address them, prevent it happening again, and creating that positive workplace culture and strong conduct standards, like I say, where everybody feels safe to call things out if they should. I'm seeing there's some questions in the chat, which I'm just going to have a look at. So it's a great question. So how are the FCA intending to monitor an NFM incidents? Are they relying on firms to provide details of such incidents? Do they log them? Are they relying on affected people to report them? So the survey, what they're looking at is the larger firms themselves. So that started off with the very large firms being required to report on these, so that larger organisations are already required to start gathering all this data. And when I looked at the survey, it was enormous. In terms of the data that firms have got to ask. So that there is that obligation is to formally report through FCA's intended reports for larger firms. But also, if you've got these kind of things, you've also, like I talked about crossover, you've got crossover in COCON. So you're required to report on COCON breaches. It's probably unlikely. Say probably unlikely. That's almost like if but maybe. If you've got a situation where there is non-financial misconduct that wouldn't really correlate with a breach of COCON, so you're already obligated to report on COCON breaches for all employees. Obviously, if that involves an SMF, you have to do that within 7 days. So there's situations there. I don't think the FCA would solely rely on the likes of whistleblowing, but I think we will see. It'd be interesting to see what comes out of this paper. I was hoping it would have been out ahead of me doing this, but they're a little bit behind. It'll be interesting to see what they're going to do, because if their proposals are in there for rule changes and guidance, I would expect them to follow up on that as well. And that might include more surveys. It might include something in their enhanced reporting. Who knows? But the FCA is expecting to see an improvement. I would expect them, where they're engaging, where there are concerns. So if, for example, they were notified of a concern, I would expect them to ask to see what the company's policies are, how it's trained into staff, how they measure it, how non-financial misconduct incidences that have arisen have been handled. I would expect them to explore anything like that where there is a situation. But if they were perhaps engaging with a firm more broadly and they were looking at their overall governance and their culture and their controls, then I would expect them to be focused on how this kind of thing has been addressed within the normal controls. I think they were quite shocked at the fact that, you know, the numbers of reporting it back up to the board were so low. So I think it will be asking more. It's not a subject that's certainly going to go away, but we'll be interested to see when they publish this paper how they're intending to get you know, better transactions on it, better transparency of it. They'll be expecting, you know, they report their numbers themselves, and they get, you know, data requests for these kind of things. The information requests that highlighted only 4 cases have been reported. So I think they will be looking to prove that they have done more to make sure that what they're calling out has been taken on board and is embedded within the industry. Are there any more questions anybody would like to ask?
Any questions, just drop them in the chat box. We'll give you a few seconds to type those out. Well, thank you very much, Nikki. That was really insightful. I found that really interesting, and I hope everyone's taken away that valuable information. Gives you a lot to think about, I think.
If there are any questions that people would like to ask separately, they wouldn't want to put it in the chat, my contact details are there. Please feel free to contact me directly, and I will make sure that, you know, I obviously keep the MGA informed of any questions that I think might be beneficial. But if you want to ask anything more privately, then please don't hesitate to get in touch with me, and I'll do my best to be able to answer those questions for you.
That's great. Thanks very much, Nikki. Yeah, before we finish, if you haven't done so already, please complete the feedback survey. I have posted it in the chat, but this will also be emailed to you alongside the recording of the event in a few weeks' time. Thank you all for joining us, and have a good afternoon. Thanks, Nikki.
Thank you.